What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the TCL 4X 5G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So my first pro for the TCL 4X 5G is the camera. With this phone, we're getting a 13 megapixel front-facing camera. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 16 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So in general, this phone has pretty much every camera feature you could ask for in a non-flagship phone. And in case you're wondering, although this phone for whatever reason doesn't have a depth sensing camera, portrait mode still does work perfectly fine. So overall, if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, the TCL 4X 5G is going to be a great option, especially considering this phone is typically around $150, and I personally even got it for $80. And for a phone that goes on sale for under $100, lots of phones like this don't even have a macro camera, let alone both a macro camera and an ultra-wide camera. So again, for just features alone, the TCL 4X 5G is already a great deal. But aside from just having the features, the photo quality is also pretty good as well. So overall, if you're taking a lot of photos, maybe to share on social media, for example, while the photo quality is obviously not going to be nearly as good as a higher end device, I do think this phone will definitely get the job done. My second pro for the TCL 4X 5G is the security features. Now, this phone does have Face Unlock, and it also has a fingerprint scanner right here on the back. And as far as functionality goes, it's definitely real fast and responsive. Let's try that one more time. And there you go. So as you can see, the fingerprint scanner works real well. And again, this phone also does have Face Unlock, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now in general, if this were more of a mid-range phone, maybe around the $300 range for example, then this definitely wouldn't be nearly as impressive. And in fact, in that price range, it's honestly more of an expectation. But for a more entry-level phone under $200, a lot of phones like this are not going to have both a fingerprint scanner and Face Unlock. And for that matter, some of them don't have either. So if you are looking for a more entry-level phone, and you do want multiple options to unlock it besides a pin, then you're definitely going to be happy with the TCL 4X 5G. My third pro for the TCL 4X 5G, honestly this is probably the best one, and that is the processor. Now with this phone, obviously as the name suggests, we are getting 5G connectivity, making it one of the most affordable 5G phones on the market. And not only that, but with 4GB of RAM in the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor, the performance is really impressive. For normal everyday activities like web browsing, social media, streaming videos and stuff like that, this phone honestly has the performance of something double its price. So if you're looking for something that has great performance for the money, while this is still not going to be anything near as fast as a $1,000 flagship phone for example, for a phone you can find sometimes for less than $100, the TCL 4X 5G is really fast. Now I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, and here are the scores I got. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone is going to be an upgrade for you, because depending on what you have, it may or may not be. If you're coming from a lower end phone, or even a slightly older mid-range phone for that matter, I do think there's a good chance it's going to be a solid upgrade. But if you have maybe an older flagship phone like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, then again keep in mind, while this phone is really fast for what it is, it's still definitely not going to be anything near that level. But again, in general, if you are looking for a really inexpensive phone that not only has 5G connectivity, but also has great performance as well, I do think you will be happy with the TCL 4X 5G. My fourth pro for the TCL 4X 5G is the battery. Now with this phone, we're getting a 4500 mAh battery. And while on one hand, this isn't quite a 5000 mAh battery, first of all, in this price range, again, keep in mind, this phone is less than $200. And a lot of these really low-end phones don't really have very large batteries. And second of all, despite having a 4500 mAh battery and not a 5000, in my experience, the battery life on this phone is still really good. So in general, if you're not always around a charger and you want a phone that has really good battery life, I do think the TCL 4X 5G is going to be a great option. And in addition to this, as far as the actual charging speed goes, although this phone doesn't really support the greatest fast charging, in my experience, it still does charge up decently fast, which is especially impressive considering this phone does have a pretty large battery. So overall, if battery life is important to you, then for what it is, I do think the TCL 4X 5G will be a good choice. And finally, my fifth pro for the TCL 4X 5G is the materials and overall design. Now in general, if this were a mid-range phone, like again maybe a $300 phone for example, I wouldn't be that impressed. In fact, in that case it might be a little disappointing. But that being said, for a really low-end phone like this, again I got this phone for $80, and in my experience, an $80 phone usually feels a lot worse than this. Despite having a slightly thicker bottom bezel and a water drop notch on the front-facing camera, overall the phone does look pretty sleek and modern. The fingerprints on the back aren't too visible, and for the materials, even though the phone is made entirely of plastic, it doesn't really feel that cheap, and the build quality is is pretty decent. I mean, it's not going to fall apart or anything, and it does have more weight to it than you might expect. So in general, although it doesn't feel premium or anything, for a more entry-level phone, I do think the overall design and build quality we're getting here is pretty good. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some drawbacks. So my first con for the TCL 4X 5G is that it doesn't have stereo audio. Now, in case you don't know what this means, when a phone has stereo audio, when you're doing something like watching a video, listening to music, stuff like that, sound is going to come out of both the main speaker and the earpiece. But with the TCL 4X 5G, unfortunately, when you're doing that kind of thing, the sound is only going to be coming out of the main speaker, so your experience is not going to be nearly as immersive. Now, that being said, it's probably not going to be a huge deal for a lot of people, because I feel like most people do use headphones anyway. But when you do have stereo audio, you do typically get a more immersive experience. And when it comes to consuming content, even if you do usually use headphones anyway, having a good quality phone speaker definitely does give you a little bit more flexibility. So in general, even though I guess it's not really that big a deal for what it is, not getting stereo audio with this phone is a little bit of a disappointment. Now, my second con for the TCL 4X 5G is the software. Now, as you can see here, this phone does currently have Android 11, and seeing that this is such a low-end phone, I honestly am not expecting any major updates either. So if you get this phone, you're pretty much going to have to commit to only having Android 11, and seeing that at this point at the end of 2022, we are going into Android 13 now, this phone is quite a bit behind when it comes to software. Now, that being said, I know not everyone really cares about having the latest version of Android, but if you do, definitely keep in mind, even in this price range, you can do better. My third con for the TCL 4X 5G is the 720p resolution. Now, with this phone, we are getting a 6.52-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 320, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So to be fair, on one hand, at just over 6.5 inches, the TCL 4X 5G does have a decently large display, and with an aspect ratio of 20:9, we are getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience, and again, with a larger display, you are going to get a pretty good experience all around. But that being said, only having a 720p resolution can be a little disappointing, and while on one hand, 1080p resolutions aren't really that common in this price range, they are still out there. So if you are doing a lot of content consumption, and you really want a high quality image, then although this phone really isn't bad for what it is, keep in mind you can still do better. My fourth con for the TCL 4X 5G is the Google Assistant button. Now, on one hand, this isn't really that big a deal, because you can disable it anyway, but at the same time, it does feel really unnecessary. I mean, there are so many other ways to get to the assistant. For example, even if you just go like this, it's going to open anyway. So honestly, having a dedicated button for such a small feature that not everyone is even going to use just feels really unnecessary. And another thing to keep in mind is that honestly, pretty much only low-end phones have this. So honestly, having this button really just makes the phone look and feel a little bit cheaper. And finally, my fifth con for the TCL 4X 5G is that it doesn't have NFC. In case you don't know what it is, NFC is the technology behind tap and pay. So if you do like to use contactless mobile payment services, unfortunately with this phone, you're not going to be able to do that. Now, on one hand, like a lot of the drawbacks on this phone, it's really just what you typically get in this price range. But at the same time, seeing that tap and pay is becoming so widely used, it is disappointing that most lower end phones nowadays still don't have NFC. But those were my pros and cons for the TCL 4X 5G. In general, despite a few drawbacks, I do think this is a pretty good phone for what it is. And if you're looking for a really inexpensive phone that has stuff like 5G connectivity, a great camera, and really good performance, then I do think the TCL 4X 5G is still worth considering. Now, once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.